This is Media Sales Mastery, the podcast for media sales professionals. In each episode, we bring you information, insights, and ideas from some of the industry's top thought leaders. Connect with us to help pick the topic and guide the show.
Hey, this is Jamie Wood. You know, one of the things if you work in media sales that becomes really apparent from day one is it's a really difficult industry to actually learn. There's no tertiary education or formal qualification for it. There's not a lot of content available to people who work in this very specific field of sales, despite the fact that there are seemingly endless trade publications and books on marketing and advertising and podcasts and all this different content for people who work in that sort of side of things. But when you think about media sales, there actually ain't a whole hell of a lot there. You really have to learn on the job. You have to learn through osmosis from observing other reps and how they operate. You've got revenue-related pressure from day one. If only there was a podcast to help you through this. There is. It's called Media Sales Mastery. You're listening to it right now. And what I just did then was a very, very bad example of sales messaging, right? I didn't lead with how the podcast is fantastic, how I do fortnightly episodes, how we've got a growing audience, all the great guests we have. What I led with was your specific problem, and a bit of an insight into your world that might make my podcast hyper relevant and have some utility. We're going to do part 2 of the Mastering Sales Messaging episode. We had Will Aitken. He is back by popular demand because he did such a good job, and I got a lot of abuse saying that the podcast episode was nowhere near long enough, and I asked very surface level questions that didn't go deep. So very keen to get into this one again. Will is an absolute weapon. A bit on him if you haven't listened to the other episode. Will runs his own sales training and facilitation, coaching and virtual course business at willaitken.com. He's a co-founder of SalesFeed. He's the host of the Sell Better podcast, and he is a fantastic content creator for those of us who have chosen to work in the field of sales. Super excited to get into part 2 of this podcast topic.
The first 5.
It's funny, I've been a sales director for many years, and over the Christmas break, I just decided to freshen up and went and actually did the course. And there's a lot of different modules, and the curriculum's quite extensive. Today's all about messaging and its various components. And I guess what I wanted to know is, like, what's your sort of personal philosophy or ethos on good sales messaging versus bad sales messaging? Can you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, I find it's best to always talk about the bad first, because that's where most people sit today and where I sat when I described myself a few years ago. And that was that most folks, when they get told to sell something, their first instinct is to immediately begin talking about how great it is. So when we're talking about outbound sales, people are sending cold emails, making cold calls, pitching how great their software is, how much better people's lives will be if they had their software, the selling points of their software. But for the most part, most people out there aren't looking for whatever it is you may be selling, especially when you get to these more niche tools and startups and it's offerings that aren't as commoditized or must-haves as like the big players and the big services that every team buys. So when you talk about your thing, your product, whatever it is you're selling, instead of what's going on in their world without it, you lose their attention very quickly because, as I said, they're not buying. So why would they care what it does? So my philosophy is that you should flip that on its head and focus entirely on the problems. What's going wrong with the absence of your product, or what could be going wrong, should I say, if they don't have your product. So focus entirely on the problems you solve, because that's the stuff that people are going to relate to and respond to instead of talking about your product, and that comes later.
Yeah, and I'd imagine with software in particular, like, you're almost having to arouse interest, or you're having to create awareness of a problem that maybe the prospect doesn't even realize they have yet as well. So leading with a product feature or what the product does might not actually have any sort of resonance with the client.
I think you hit the nail on the head as well. Let's put this into a real example. Can you think of a product that you use every day?
This one's a bit boring, but coffee. I need coffee every day.
All right. So let's just that's a really good example, actually, because everyone can relate to this, right? But maybe not the people who aren't using it, right? So the problem that coffee solves is tiredness, lack of focus. The impacts of that mean less productivity, unhappier life. In some cases, I know mine, when I don't have my coffee, I have a rough day. So when we think about the problems of that and the impacts that can have is lower productivity, maybe not getting as done as much work. If I came to someone who doesn't drink coffee and I started talking about the amazing flavors and notes in my coffee that I'm trying to sell them. I'm like, yeah, it tastes amazing. It's got this. It helps. It's going to make you feel more awake. It's gonna do all these amazing things for you. They're just going to be like, no, I don't care, because I'm not trying to buy coffee. And I start to go, well, it's roasted in Colombia and it's fresh. And they're going to be like, no, what? I don't drink coffee. Please leave me alone. However, if I start talking about the problems, which we just went over, hey, a lot of folks are feeling like they're not very productive in the morning. A lot of folks feel like they're not very awake, or when they get a bad night's sleep, they really struggle to do their work. And someone relates to that, then I can then make coffee the solution to the problem I've outlined, versus telling them all the amazing things about my coffee and what makes it different. Instead, just focusing on the problem of their life, what it might be like, or the problems they might have about coffee. And they might still not have any problems. They might not relate to that problem. They might be like, no, I drink tea, or I've never drank coffee, so I didn't become addicted to the silly stuff and depend on it like you do, obviously. So that could be a quick and easy, simple analogy or breakdown of like focusing on the problem, tiredness, lack of alertness, lack of focus, the impacts, not being able to get your work done, not being productive, potentially getting put on performance improvement plans because you just aren't hitting your job's requirements, and then obviously, and then you go into the coffee and how it solves that.
Such a great analogy.
Media sales mastery.
And we've done previous episodes on like value props, and I guess I'm eager to explore how a value proposition specifically comes to life in your sales messaging. Like, what's your approach to articulating a value prop when you're prospecting for new clients?
My value prop for whatever it is I'm selling, let's pick up an example of coffee again, is I think about all the things that clients like and we can deliver on, and then I flip it on its head and focus on the problems of that. And that's my value prop. We solve that problem. So let's say I'm a recruiter. I help people get hired, right? I help people hire the best staff. So my value prop becomes the opposite of that, which is people are struggling to find people for their roles, find the right people for their roles. That's what I solve. So that becomes my value prop. Now, the easiest way to do this is to look into, if you're starting from scratch here, is look into people who have bought from you in the past, look at the reasons why they bought, and look at what their lives were like before they had your product or your solution. And that becomes your roadmap to success, because that's the reason that those people bought, why they couldn't keep doing things the way they were doing them, and bought your product is the before. So we need to focus on the before, articulate that, and then we can talk about how we can help them solve that and see if there's any interest for them to solve that.
You gave a really great example. I remember in the course, I think it was Pac-Man. Does that sound familiar? It was a good example.
Yeah, the Pac-Man one.
Yeah, it was around, I guess, how to command attention with a value proposition versus like a more generic or general type of sales messaging.
Yeah, so Pac-Man's one example. Mario could be another one, right? So like, let's say if we're selling the mushroom in Mario, and Mario's never heard of a mushroom, and we're trying to get him to eat this dodgy mushroom. Are we going to talk about how big we're going to make him? Or it's like, okay, we've got this great mushroom. It's going to make you big. It's going to give you an extra life. It's going to it's going to make this cool sound play in the background when you eat it as well. It changes the soundtrack. Mario's like, that's a dodgy mushroom. I ain't eating that thing. I ain't going near that. But if we start talking about Mario's life without the mushroom, hey, Mario, you finding yourself dying and having to restart the level every time you walk into a Koopa? Are you finding yourself missing jumps, or are you finding yourself unable to jump up to ledges? Well, guess what? We have a mushroom that's going to be able to solve all of those things. Does it sound interesting to you? That becomes my value prop for the mushroom. Because if Mario doesn't know what a mushroom is, he doesn't really care about the mushroom. He feels like he can not eat the mushroom, essentially. Whereas if we start talking about the things that he can't do without it, like the fact he keeps dying, the fact he can't pass the level, the fact he can't jump up to a certain ledge because he's not tall enough, well, at that point, we can get him to think, oh, actually, those are problems that I need to solve, and that's why it's worth investing in eating this dodgy mushroom.
It's so obvious when you actually think of it in those terms. It's amazing how many media sales professionals just overlook this approach. The best example I can give is if you're a radio rep putting a cold call into a car dealership, and it's like, we're the number one station in town. We've got the most listeners intending to buy a car. We've got this great breakfast show that we could integrate your brand into. We could do these great giveaways, versus I drove past your dealership. I saw you have about 10 of last year's models. We've got some promotional ideas that could help sell them. Would you like to meet and hear those? Like, it's a very simple switch, but it actually takes some time to almost break the habit. Or like that entrenched behavior. It's so ingrained in so many people that we don't really consider media can also have this type of value proposition.
That's such a good example of that right there as well. And which one builds more curiosity to you? You know, like, oh, this person's got ideas, they can help me. Because all we're trying to do especially when we're prospecting, is get someone curious enough to have a conversation with us, generate a little bit of interest, a little bit of curiosity that's going to make them go, what have I potentially missed here? What else have they got for me? So now they've said, yes, that's me. Then they're open to looking at a way to solve that. You're now in a conversation where it's much easier to then actually get them to realize the value of all these amazing things that you can do for them.
It probably sort of feeds into this tension between quality and quantity metrics that are so important. You know, we hear a lot about activity equals results, and just sheer brute force can often be a major part of someone being successful in sales. That type of value proposition or that type of opportunity might take a little bit more research, might take a little bit more commercial awareness. Where do you think the balance is, and what would you recommend someone implements as a tool to like focus their efforts to find that sweet spot between quality and quantity?
Yeah, I think that can be a misconception that you have to sacrifice on quantity to reach some level of quality. I guess to a certain extent, right? I think the only difference is being more intentional about how you do things. The issue is if there are downsides to playing the quantity card as well. So I can send 1,000 emails and I can get 10 responses, or I can send 100 emails and get 10 responses, but the 100 emails take me way longer to do. But we don't think about the other 900 people that we probably just put off and got ignored by. We don't think about the email deliverability mistakes we just made that are now going to make it harder for our future emails to get delivered. We don't think about all these 900 people who now are going to write us off even if we reach back out to them because they've already decided in their mind they're not interested in this. We don't think about the reputational damage that can cause. So in my mind, the best way to do things to rebalance that quantity versus quality is just target better. So you mentioned earlier, you know, if I'm selling radio ads and I'm reaching out to car dealerships and I'm trying to get them on, right? Well, that already is enough of a segment as well. We've segmented it a little bit more so we can make our message more quality. So that could be, hey, car dealership owner, manager, whoever the person at that business might be. We've already segmented down to car dealerships. We can send them a more quality message by saying a lot of other car dealerships are finding that this time of year, really slow for sales. You know, people are waiting for the interest rates to do this or that. And then we can go into the problem. You know, there's just less people come through the door. This other company, car dealership we work with, has seen these results by running a radio ad. Is this something you've tried out in the past? You know, that could be the message. And we've already improved the quality just by segmenting and writing a specific message to car dealerships. We go further than that and look for the signals that a car dealership might be struggling to drive foot traffic. So again, you said, oh, there's cars in your lot from last year. Well, what are the other symptoms or signs that someone might be struggling and not getting enough people through the door? They're probably losing some of their sales staff because they don't need as many sales staff because they've not got the traffic. They're probably... heck, we could probably even do a website view to see what stock they've got in, right? And there are all kinds of different tools out there, I'm certain of it, that would allow you to do that at scale as well. They might be seeing a decreased headcount. There might be something in the news about that particular brand or model right now that could be causing an impact on all dealerships for Toyota, let's say. And then we can reach out to 20 different Toyota dealerships, depending on how big of a media we're offering, if we're a national or regional media outlet. And we can go over messages like that. So I'd say to balance it, the segmentation and the targeting makes all the difference there. And if we're targeting smart, we can use a message that relates to the targeting.
Yeah, and I think there was I know I'm asking you to share a lot of examples, but I thought you had some great analogies that really contextualize this stuff. And the one I loved was like when looking at ideal customer profiles, i.e. a car dealership this time of year, it's a starving crowd for us because of these reasons, therefore it's ideal. We've worked with them in the past. There's certain triggers we're seeing. Like all of these things make them an ideal prospect, and it makes that conversation much easier. The analogy I think you used, which was great, was of an ice cream truck, cruising around the streets of like Nova Scotia in winter.
Yeah. That's the anyone's a fit mentality, right?
Yeah.
If you're running an ice cream truck, you're not going to go and drive around downtown in the middle of winter, you know that if you know the problems you solve, you can work them backwards to figure out where you should be spending your time. So if you know the problems you solve are for an ice cream truck, the fact they're not near a store, so their kids can't run down to a store and get ice cream, the fact that it's hot and they need to find something to cool down, and kids like sweet stuff, and it's a relief and something to distract parents, then you know you're going to spend your time driving around places where it's warm or in the summertime. You're going to drive around places that don't have easy access to a nearby convenience store or supermarket, and you're going to spend your time driving around the suburbs where there's high frequencies of young families, right? So working that backwards is exactly the same. If your media is going to solve low foot traffic and it's going to solve low customers, where can you spend your time and who can you spend your time near talking to who are most likely to be facing those problems? So once you figure out what the signs of those problems are, almost like a doctor looking for symptoms of a disease, you can start to figure out, oh, that's who I should be reaching out to and prioritizing folks accordingly, and then reaching out with messaging that relates to why you think they might be more of a fit than others, or might be more likely to be facing that problem than others.
There was a great book I read over the Christmas break called $100 Million Offers, and it had a very similar sort of analogy around this idea of find a starving crowd. And it's like, if you're prospecting, I think the analogy he used was, if you run a hot dog stand, like, what are you going to choose? Are you going to have the best hot dogs, the best ingredients, the best pricing, etc.? Or do you want the location that's right near a college football stadium, right? Like, you're going to sell hot dogs if you've got the college football stadium on. And I think our approach to prospecting can sometimes be the same, where reps can really kind of go down a path of being enchanted by certain industries or verticals or clients, but not necessarily kind of realize that maybe that prospect doesn't have a strong motivation or a really strong need. Not saying that you shouldn't prospect clients who you have an interest or passion for, by the way, but it's about really making sure that you're putting that common sense filter over, does this particular prospect really have a strong motivation or desire or trigger or need to work with me?
Yeah. And here's an actual example to hammer that point home. A couple of years ago, I was selling e-sign software, and I was trying to sell to all these software companies. But 90% of, I would say 99% of software companies are already using e-sign software. And I was trying to win on, we're better e-sign software. The e-sign software you use is probably, if it's DocuSign, then it's not giving you these functionalities. Now, when I looked across a different industry entirely, which was, in this example, landscaping, it was right around COVID. Commercial landscaping companies typically used to drop their proposals off in person. And due to the pandemic, they were no longer allowed to do that. That's a much bigger problem and a much better problem for me to solve. And there's so many companies facing that problem that I could almost target just landscaping companies and say, hey, my message becomes, hey, look, spotty in commercial landscaping. Looks like a lot of folks typically have traditionally been handing out the proposals to their clients in person, haven't been able to do so, which has hurt their close rates, hurt their ability to give a really good client experience and make sure that they're getting face time with their prospects. Would you be open to seeing the next best thing you can do to do similar work digitally? And that immediately resonates with them. And instead of trying to chase these beautiful software companies with big logos and lots of sales reps, these commercial landscaping companies sometimes had 100 sales reps, and I was selling on a license model. So there was still money for me to be made there. And the only thing I changed was my targeting, my value prop to relate to that targeting.
Yeah, and you're sort of in that whole blue ocean thing. It's a much more uncontested market space to be selling into in many ways, because, again, they're probably not even aware of the solution. We had a similar thing in a previous role I was in, which was out-of-home advertising, so billboards. And we were prospecting e-commerce. And, they tend to favor digital marketing very heavily. Yeah. It's all about digital marketing for a lot of them because they're a predominantly online business. One of the reps came up with this fantastic kind of value prop where they went, one of the things about e-com, though, is you don't have that physical brick and mortar presence. Now, there's two problems that arise from that. You're not mentally available as much. You haven't necessarily been able to brand yourself as much because a physical storefront does actually brand a business and creates a level of awareness. And there is a trust factor. If I've got a physical location, then I'm a reputable business. I trust that everything's above board. Doing a major scale out-of-home campaign with billboards effectively replicates what these brick and mortar players have. So again, it was one of these really interesting angles where you go, okay, they need to sell product, they need to advertise, but actually the problem that we're solving for here is probably something that isn't immediately obvious to the prospect until we've kind of brought it to their attention. Really cut through. He had great success with that particular approach until everybody started replicating it.
Until everyone starts doing it, and then it's the pattern, and then you have to find a new way to interrupt it.
Exactly. And I think, one thing, this is a big thing about, becoming stale. One thing that's definitely becomes quite stale in media sales is our approach to targeting clients proactively. The usual trigger might be something like seasonality. A jewelry brand wants to advertise before Valentine's Day. Maybe it's historical spend data. The client does a campaign every year in August. Let's call them and see if they want to run it again this year. These approaches sort of really lack depth. And I guess I'm curious from you, from the outside, what are some potential ways of identifying patterns or triggers that might make a prospect more relevant to speak with?
For media, yeah, I would say just think of a handful. New locations, often a big problem when someone opens a new location is that no one knows about it. So if no one knows about it, that new location is more likely to fail. I like your seasonality piece. That's one that I've used an example for restaurants in the past, especially restaurants in a very... I almost got a job selling newspaper ads, and I was thinking about what messaging I would have used for that. And it would have been like, okay, well, it's in a town that's very tourist heavy. These restaurants could open doors, and then the problem could be that they have a great time in the high season, but nothing's going on in the low season, right? Thinking also where else they advertise. I'd be looking for, okay, they're obviously advertising in newspapers. If I'm selling radio ads, that's a trigger for me, because then I can talk about the problems that they might. It's great they're advertising, but what aren't they getting from the newspaper ads? I'd also say signs that someone might need more people through the door. If they're struggling, if you have a physical presence and you can look at traffic, if you have a person in their same geographic radius, a lot of times, especially when we're selling to brick and mortar stores, may not work as well for large chains when we're talking about the enterprise media. But they often, whether they're on a retail estate or they're on a high street, they often know the other names around there. So you can build some familiarity by leading with the fact that you work with someone else in their space. So, my buddy runs a shop here in Halifax, Nova Scotia, called the Great British Pride Store or something like that. And he sells like eclairs and different British foods that you can't really get in Canada. But he's right up next to a laser studio and a computer hardware store. So I could say, and he knows both those owners very well, and then he knows the third and fourth person on the block as well. So if I can work with any of those, then I can build some familiarity and use that as my trigger. Hey, I'm working with Jill over at, Atlantic Computer Bits. Would you be open to seeing some ways that we're helping to drive more traffic? That could be a trigger in itself.
Like straight away, you've just provided heaps of examples there. And I just think that's one of the biggest things that, needs a bit of a refresh, right? Particularly, I think, where, you have certain media sales professionals who have a pretty good client list. They managed it pretty well. There's a bit of a rinse and repeat approach to every year. And I think one of the hardest things to kind of break there is like, well, how do I keep my approach to prospecting fresh? And how do I make sure that, for whatever reason, if I'm reaching out to a new prospective advertiser, like I'm not just going with this stock standard kind of outreach messaging.
Yeah. I think the worst thing you can do is just send out a media card to everyone.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Hey, I got some listener questions here.
I can't ask my sales manager that.
Hi Jamie, I'm a big fan of cold calling, but I've noticed that I'm getting way more voicemails than a few years ago. Have you got any tips to either get more pickups on the call or conversely to get more people to call me back?
I mean, COVID definitely has had a massive impact on the way we do outreach. What's your thought? Is this a common problem you're seeing?
Yeah, definitely across all sectors. Connect rates are way down. People aren't picking up the phone as much. There are new tools and softwares out there to identify spam likely calls. You might have seen it on your own phone. Samsung, Apple do it these days. They're like spam likely. So there's all kinds of things you need to be aware of, both the number you're calling from, and there are tools you can use to change that number. So what I recommend doing is maybe calling yourself off your business phone and seeing if it is triggering as spam likely or whatever tool you're using, and then changing it if it is. Secondly, the obvious one is like what time of day and day of week you call. That's going to be different for every industry. Retailers have a very different busy period to offices, let's say. So just experimenting, changing up the times, changing up the cadence. For voicemails, me personally, if I'm calling someone, I've almost always got their email. And selling to businesses like white collar industries, their emails are normally pretty active. So I might leave a voicemail that says, "Hey, it's Will here. I know I don't get that many callbacks from voicemails anyway, so I'm just going to say, don't worry about calling me back. I'm going to pop you an email of the subject line and then say whatever the subject line for that particular sequence or targeted segment is. Let me know if it's relevant or not. And then I might leave another voicemail later on asking for a callback, but I start with that one because that's much more likely to get them to act on it. There are also a ton of tools out there that are really worth checking out, investing in. I'm a big fan of a dialer, which solves the connect problem, because even with all those things, connect rates are still down. So wherever possible, get a mobile number. Obviously, getting a good data source for getting those numbers is important. But also use a dialer. So there's tools out there that allow you to make 5 simultaneous cold calls. So as long as you've got a big enough list, you can call 5 people at the same time, therefore multiplying the chance of you speaking to someone by 5 times without spending more time calling 5 more people, right? It just depends on how big your addressable market is in that case. If you can only sell to 100 locations, you're probably not going to be able to use one of those. But if you've got, thousands upon thousands of potential customers, then definitely use a dialer.
Mate, great advice. I've really enjoyed chatting. Will, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Hey, this is Jamie. One of the things that I did over the Christmas break was refreshed a little bit on B2B sales. And I actually bought Will's B2B sales virtual course, went back and refreshed myself. And one of the things that I kind of remember thinking when I was doing the course was, how the hell did I hear about this guy? And when I actually reverse engineered it, I realized that I had been seeing a lot of Will's videos and content appearing in my news feed on LinkedIn. Will does really funny, educational, informative, but very funny videos. A lot of great content for people in sales. This is the audio grab of a skit that he does, or he's got a series of skits around this theme, which is all around if other departments were treated like sales. I want to share it with you now because I think it's just such a good example of the content that he does. And if this doesn't inspire you to follow him on LinkedIn, I don't know what will. So here it is, if other departments were treated like sales.
Product, that new feature you launched, no one's using it. And as such, we will be clawing back your salary for the past 3 months. You'll be paying that back to us, okay? Keep it real. Marketing. That email campaign you just ran, the best performing email campaign in company history. With that said, we did look in MailChimp and there appeared to be some notes missing in there. So we have to put you on a coaching plan. You might want to start saying your goodbyes now. Reception! I'm sorry, where are you going? I know it's 5 o'clock, but I checked your activity metrics and you only picked up the phone 6 times today. If you're happy, settling for the bare minimum of what we asked for you, then that's fine by me, but every single high-performing receptionist that I've worked with in my career has gone above and beyond. So I'd urge you to reconsider your work ethic, you lazy wankers!